Welcome back to another episode of the Executive Code Podcast. If you want to find out more information about ourselves, what is that we're doing, we talk about personal mastery, we talk about business mastery, we talk about finding your purpose. That's what this podcast is all about. And if you want to find out more, you can head over to our website, paulwilliamdavis.com, where there's a lot more resources there available for you. And you can also join our community, which is named after our podcast, which is the Executive Code. You can join our Executive Code community, whereby we discuss the same subject matter. We go a little bit more deeper, and we answer a lot of people's questions in the lounges within our Executive Code community. So, Nicole, what's the question that you have for us this week?
So, Paul, I'll be starting training for a new job soon, and I was wondering, how is learning as an adult different from learning as a child? Do you have any study tips for adult learners in particular?
Yep. Okay, cool. First of all, learning as a child is actually quite significantly different to learning as an adult. And some people may not recognize what the differences are. First of all, from my perspective, when it comes to the education system, and I can't talk from a global perspective, I can only talk within Ireland. I feel, perhaps from my own perspective, that the education system is flawed. That's one thing. And what do I mean by that? When you're a child and you're going through the education system, so let me start off there, because that's what most people will be used to in going through that system. And if they've got kids, they'll see it materialize in their kids as well. It's more, the kind of learning is more focused towards rote learning as opposed to problem solving or creative thinking. So we're not using our brain and our mind in order to come up with more and solve more problems. Now, they have started to introduce elements of that, but the vast majority of the curriculum that kids are learning right now at the moment is rote learning. It's learning the history, it's learning what's been in the past, as opposed to creative thinking for the future. So that's where I have a lot of difficulties, let's put it that way, when it comes to the education system. When it comes to the education system, when it comes to our kids, it's about trying to make everybody the same as opposed to being individual. And if you listened to our last episode that we recorded, I spoke about what's the future going to look like going forward. And that individuality piece is just going to be so much more important, or it's going to manifest itself more as we move forward in the years. It doesn't teach, for example, the skills for life. So hence the reason why a lot of adults are listening to this podcast or are part of the community, because they're actually trying to learn those skills for life that they weren't and they didn't learn back in school. And they can be as simple as, okay, there's personal mastery of the skills. There's skills that needs to be learned in terms of how we deal with the challenges in life. There's skills in relation to how do we manage money and how do we budget and how do we look after our lifestyle from that perspective, as opposed to perhaps maybe learning history or languages or science or whatever. Are they important? Yeah, they're important to an extent, but it would be great if we actually brought in some more personal development skills within our education system. That's just one thing. It's a lot of what I feel is taught, because I have two adult kids. They're 27, 25. And even if I go back to my own learning in school, the vast majority of what I learned and the vast majority of what my kids learned in school is not relevant whatsoever to them. I personally absolutely hated school. I didn't enjoy it whatsoever. There's only some subjects that I actually enjoyed in secondary school, which were business, accounting, and economics. I loved economics. So, but if I take all the other subjects that we learned in school, they weren't relevant, and I don't use any of it whatsoever to this day. So when we're a child, we don't get to choose what we're to learn. We're told what we're going to learn, and that's very different. We're told that if we're going to learn right now at the moment as a kid, we're told, well, this is going to benefit you in the future. So therefore, it's a long-term reward, as opposed to when you're learning as an adult, it's very, very short-term. And what do I mean by that is, when you're learning as an adult, you've got a choice, first of all, in relation to what it is that you want to learn. And second of all, you can pretty much implement what you're learning in the short term, or if not the immediate term, compared to learning as a child. So there's just some of the difference between when we're learning as an adult versus learning as a child, and some of the, for one better word, the issues that I have with the education system. first of all, when you're an adult, so the course that you're going to be learning on now, Nicole, is that you're typically going to be able to apply that pretty much immediately. Would I be right in that?
Yeah, pretty much almost, right away.
Yeah. So what you're going to have then is that because you're able to go to apply it immediately, you're going to have instant benefits and instant gratification. And that instant gratification is going to cause literally the serotonin and the dopamine in your mind to fire off, because now you're seeing the reward for the work that you put in pretty much immediately. It's a bit like, let me use the analogy of when you bake a cake, well, then it's only going to take you whatever it might be, half an hour to an hour to bake a cake. But as soon as it comes out of the oven, you can start eating that cake. You're getting pretty much instant gratification from the work that you've done in baking the cake. When it comes to adult learning, it's pretty much the same thing. You can apply what you've learned very quickly. The only thing, so let me talk about some of the tips or some of the areas that you want to look at, is that when it comes to adult learning, it typically is less fun. Okay. Whereas when you're a kid, most of what you're learning, or most of what they try and structure throughout the day, is kind of some of those fun activities. So what I tend to do, let's just give a bit of a tips, is that I look at how can I make my learning experience more of an experience that I enjoy. So a lot of the learning that I would do is I will typically look to see, can I do the learning in another country as opposed to doing it in the country that I'm in? And the reason being is because A, I love flying. B, I love going to other countries. I love seeing other countries and experiencing other countries. So now what I'm doing is I'm wrapping that experience around the learning that I'm doing. So the vast majority of that learning that I've done over the years has always been in a different country. So that's how perhaps you can start to bring in some of those fun elements. The course that you're planning on doing is just to see, okay, so what are the elements from a fun perspective? Because the more fun we're having, the easier and the more we're going to learn. So that's down to, okay, so if you're an instructor, that has to be applied from that perspective. Some of the things that you want to look at is, okay, there's what's referred to as format. And format is that there's 4 headings, which is why, what, how, and what if. So in the learning that you're doing as an adult, what you want to look at is, so understand why you're doing the learning or the course that you're doing in the first place. What do you need to learn? How do you need to learn it? And the what ifs. The what ifs are, well, then what if something goes wrong? Or what if you don't pass? Or what if you mess up in some way? Or you fail a particular module within the training that you're doing? Again, from your perspective around being a pilot, for other people, it might be an MBA that they're doing or a particular degree that they're doing. It just depends on what they're learning. But when you approach it from that perspective, as the human mind works, you're tackling the why first. And if you can address the why in why it is that you're doing, meaning the learning that you're doing, now it's going to open the mind in order to be more open to the learning that's actually going to achieve or what it's planned to do. What you, however, want to look at is that when it comes to being an adult, unfortunately, we're at a particular age and we're past our formative years, unlike being as a child. And now we have our own belief system. And here's the challenge for people, because people don't like change. And people are trying to hang on to their belief systems as much as they possibly can, because that's what they know, that's their map of the world, and that's what their comfort zone is. So the more you can approach your learning from the perspective of how can you apply it, or what new things can you learn, and for one better word, be open-minded, because what you may think of is that something's got to be done in a particular way, or it's going to be taught in a particular way, or your way of doing things is the best way. That's a belief system coming through. And the more you can actually be open-minded and ask open-ended questions, and open-ended questions will be, okay, how can I apply this? Or what else do I need to learn? So they're all open-ended questions as opposed to shutting your brain down or shutting your mind down. That has a huge impact in relation to learning that you're doing. Most people don't like change. So as adults, we don't like change, and that propensity to not like change actually increases the more years you have on you. Let's put it that way. We also don't like risk. So when you're younger, the risk that you'll take will be much, much higher compared to when you're an adult, you'll actually reduce the level of risk that you'll take. And that still applies to learning or every single thing that you'll do in your life. So therefore, what you want to look at is how can you reduce the risk that you have in the learning that you're doing? And what that kicks into then is fear, shame, and guilt, because that's ultimately what's going to come true in relation to the risk. So when it comes to risk, what are you afraid of? If you were to not pass the exam, well, then would you feel shame or would you feel guilt? What's the fears that are coming up? In relation to shame, you may feel that, okay, I'm not good enough to do the course that I'm doing, or I'm not good enough to pass, or what be. That's what literally typically will come up for an adult. Less so when you're a child, but that's what's going to come up for an adult from that perspective. So then what you want to look at is, okay, how can we start to neutralize or dissolve that fear, shame, and guilt as you're going through or as you're starting to approach a learning journey? For some people, I actually don't know whether there's any science behind this, but I know I've observed it. You will start off in a learning journey and you'll be hugely enthusiastic about what it is that you're to learn. So your commitment to the learning will be really, really high, but you don't know what you don't know yet. Okay. So therefore, the amount of knowledge that you have in the course will be very, very low. So you're high commitment, but you've low knowledge. But as soon as you start to learn, well, then now you're starting to be aware of all the things that you don't know, and therefore all the things that need to be learned. And what tends to happen then, our motivation or our commitment to that course now starts to decline, because now we're getting to realize consciously all the things that we don't know. So that motivation now starts to, it's like air going out of a balloon, it starts to deplete. Now, what happens for some people is that they start to give up, because now they start to self-doubt themselves from the perspective of, oh my God, all the stuff I need to learn, there's no way I'm going to get through all that learning. There's no way. So all now their fear starts to show up, their shame and their guilt starts to show. So from the perspective of when they realize all the things that they need to learn, and that motivation starts to wane, a choice appears for people in the sense of, will I continue with the learning or will I just give up? And you see this across the board in terms of different courses that are being done, and whether it be from a personal mastery perspective, where I see a lot of people, they'll learn, but they won't do the work, and therefore they'll walk away, and all they'll do is you just end up in a cycle again. And they'll try another course, see if that works, but ultimately the fundamental thing is they're not doing the work. Ultimately, what's happening is that motivation is dropping. What you got to understand is and know that that's what's actually happening, and all you've got to do is keep back doing what you're doing. That's all you got to do, and push past that barrier. Now, can that barrier be huge? It absolutely can be huge. Is it going to bring some tears? Yeah, probably highly likely it's going to bring some tears, because there may be come back from a course some evening and you're sitting there on the couch crying your eyes out saying, I can't do this, I can't continue on, there's so much I need to know, there's so much I need to do, and you're there crying on the couch saying, I'm going to give up. But all you got to do is keep at it and doing what you're doing. And then what you do is you get past that threshold, and then what actually starts to happen is you get to more experience in what it is that you're doing, your knowledge is growing, and now your motivation starts to increase back up again. And when that motivation starts to increase back up again, now that's where the self-belief comes back in. You say, actually, no, I can do this. So when people understand that journey that happens for every single individual when they're learning something, all they got to remember is, I got to push through this barrier. Now, I did hear somewhere before whereby it happens either the third week, the third month, or the third year of a course. So what do I mean by that? If it's a short course, let's say it's 5 weeks, it's a 5-week course, that dip will typically happen in week 3. If it's a year-long course, that dip will typically happen in month 3. If it's a 4-year course, that dip will typically happen in year 3. So that's how the tree starts to come through in relation to that. So when you know it's going to happen, all you got to be aware of it, and therefore you got to push yourself past it in order for that motivation, that commitment to come back up again. So therefore you can finish the course and actually get the qualification that you want. If you're asking me in terms of if there's a course that you feel you need to do, but you can't see how you're not really highly motivated to do because it's something that you have to do. What I would absolutely say to an individual is that the more you align the course to your genius drivers and how it actually serves you and how it benefits you, now what you're going to do is you're going to play with your mind from the perspective of getting over that hurdle and now seeing how that course benefits you or serves you in what it is that you're to do. Be open and be curious. That's ultimately it. Like there's a sign behind me, Nicole, that you probably can't see it because it's on the shelf. And what the sign says is wisdom begins with wonder. And what it means is the more wonder that you have in the world, well, then the more wisdom that you're going to gain. It's you ask questions, you be curious, be open, and you'll learn so much more as opposed to being closed. The more fun you can bring into it, the better it is, and the much more you're going to learn. There may be just some of the elements, perhaps that I think about in relation to if you're trying to learn as an adult. One of the things that like I'm constantly learning, so it just depends on what the challenges that people have when they're trying to learn.
That's an interesting point about the threes, because it shows that it doesn't really, the dip doesn't show up where, it depends on how long a course is. It seems to be a particular point, no matter how long a course is.
Yeah.
And I wish I wish they would have taught us how to file taxes in school, because that's why as adults we need accountants. But as pilots, we're always learning, and in a formal training environment, you may be learning complicated systems or having to rely on rote learning when memorizing things like speeds or altitudes, for example. So there is some need for rote learning, even as adults, before we are able to apply the knowledge and skills learned in real life.
Well, what you'll find, so I'm glad you raised that, Nicole, because when we have to learn rote stuff and we got to learn a sequence, the best thing that you can do is apply it to a story. So some people do this and they'll apply a story to the sequence that they got to learn. They apply maybe perhaps an acronym to what they need to learn, or they'll apply a song or a poem to what they need to learn. So everybody will remember nursery rhymes, and nursery rhymes plays on that sequence from the perspective. It's fun, it follows a rhythm, and it's basically, for one better word, you could put a message in every single sentence in a poem, and it just makes it so much easier to learn. So when it comes to that kind of side of things, it's there is a technique that we learn in neurolinguistic programming, NLP, whereby we make up unusual stories in order to remember the sequence of something that we need to learn.
So are there any learning skills or study habits that we should develop early, such as when we're kids, that will be useful to us as adults?
The only thing I've ever taught my kids when it comes to learning is doing the questions, as opposed to learning and just reading the book. Because learning and reading the book, you'll get something from it, but two aspects. One is you start to get bored with just reading the stuff that you've got to learn. You have to learn it. You don't really want to learn, but you have to learn it. And what's worked for me and what's worked for the kids is that when they start to actually do the questions, now they can see the application of what they're learning to answer the questions. And that becomes a little bit more fun, or becomes a little bit more understanding as regards why they need to learn. And then it highlights the gaps of what they haven't learned. That's just, it's a technique that I've always used throughout my learning in all the exams I've done. So I've done accountancy, I've done electronics, I've done, as an electrical engineering, I've done accountancy, I've done taxation, and I've done a whole load of other courses. And that's just something that I've always applied, and it's always worked. Whether there's any science behind that, I actually really don't know, to be honest. It's just something I've naturally done.
And what do you think about, you hear about people saying that if you really want to master an area of knowledge, you should teach it, or at least, try to explain
absolutely.
it to someone, who knows nothing about that.
Yeah, absolutely great point, because you've got to become the expert in the knowledge. So absolutely, that works really, really well. It just depends. Most people can't have that as a way to learn. So, for example, you're learning to a certain aspect of your pilot license. So Could you teach other people? Yeah, you could probably teach some of your friends that you go up in aircraft with, and that maybe haven't learned that. So therefore, that's your way of actually getting that knowledge in order to pass it on to somebody else, because now you're seeing an instant benefit or an instant gratification or an instant acknowledgement in the learning that you're doing. And that's how that's operating.
And that skill can actually be, practiced as a kid as well. You could teach, someone who in a lower grade, for example, and it would also relieve the burden of teachers, because they would just be kind of managing, making sure that you're teaching the correct thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It does work really, really well. It just depends on how, trying to work out how can you actually apply it. And that's where you'll see a lot of study groups form from the perspective of, and if you don't have a study group, it's okay, how can you bring a study group together? If you start to ask, not about learning, but if you start to ask challenging questions of each other, now you're getting a better understanding of what it is that you're learning. And it's using that same technique of applying what you're learning by teaching somebody else. Because ultimately, if you're asking challenging questions, you're indirectly teaching somebody else.
I think my biggest takeaway is just to push through that barrier, when you get that to that point where you're doubting yourself and your motivation just decreases. And it could be something that, is in line with your purpose and you really want to do. But flying, for example, it gets really hard sometimes. And, you think about giving up, or you think about, just walking away from it and doing something else that maybe you'll like as well. But it's all about getting over that hump and just doing it.
That's all. Yeah, it's perseverance, and keeping an eye on the end goal, and knowing, okay, if when you get to the end goal, here's the difference it's actually going to make. Yeah, so it's breaking through that barrier, and unfortunately, that barrier is always there. So it's a case of knowing that it's there in the first place, and then saying, okay, I'm going to bash through this and break through it. Yeah.
That's not exclusive to adults as well, because I remember, being a teenager and having that barrier as well. So it's not just maybe not so much as a kid, but I think once you get to like your teens, you're pretty much considered an adult learner already.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's right throughout the whole, right from being a child upwards, but we don't really recognize it as a child, and hopefully because we're having so much fun in doing the learning. But as we get into teenage years and upwards, now that's where it really starts to show up. Yeah. Excellent. Thanks very much, Nicole, for that question. I hope it's been of benefit to you guys as listeners. If you want to find out more information about what it is that we're doing, or you want help or support in finding what your purpose is, or knowing more about personal mastery or business mastery for that matter, head over to paulwilliamdavis.com. All the links are there. All other resources are there available for you. And the best way is to go over to paulwilliamdavis.com, and you'll find everything out there in terms of how you can reach out to us and find other ways to support you on your journey. But until next time, I wish you every success.